Okay. So, hi everyone. Good morning. Happy Friday. Welcome to the Mental Health and Wellness Training Series for Youth Workers. My name is Sarah Michael Gaston, pronouns she and her. I am a policy advocate with Youth Forward, and we, along with several other organizations, wanted to put together a training series for those in the youth development field who are currently trying to navigate supporting young people during this pandemic and giving them more tools and resources to better support the mental wellness and well-being of young people. So that's why we're here today, to really bring you content to really just bolster uh, young people right now. So today we have Brinn Langdale. She is a marriage and family therapist that works primarily with adolescents. And today she's going to talk about the impacts of marijuana on young people's health and well-being, and how you can mitigate some of those early behaviors um, to mitigate substance use. And we're really excited to have her because she has presented for us before and is amazing. And I think you all will really enjoy what she has planned for you. So I will pass the mic to Brinn now.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sarah Michael. I really appreciate it. Good morning, everybody. It's great to be here. I know I did some sessions with this group back at, in the fall of last year. And so it's really great to be here again. And yeah, I'll just go ahead and I think I can start sharing my screen. All right, there we go. So just to give you a little bit of background for myself, I'm a marriage family therapist, and I've worked primarily with youth for a long time. Outside of clinical setting, I've been working with youth for about 15 years, done a lot of mentoring, educating in various ways, various settings, and now as a licensed therapist, I work a lot with adolescents and young adults. And I really enjoy that time frame, mostly because I know what I was dealing with when I was a teenager and a young adult. And I'm sure we can all kind of think back to those days, and really just wanting to be that support for a young person, because we know that they're going through so much. And that's really the group that I'm talking to today, right? You all are doing so much work in the community for young people, and that is absolutely amazing. And so I always really like to say and really hit home the point that just by you being in a youth's life and just by you having that connection with them is making a positive difference in their life and is helping to keep them off substances in general. And so your work is very important. So thank you for that. So today, what we're going to be talking about today is marijuana, mental health, and trauma, kind of like where the worlds collide. And that's because in the mental health field, I've really witnessed a lot of, okay, yes, we can acknowledge mental health is an issue. Absolutely. We can acknowledge substance is an issue, trauma is an issue. And really, I think it's important to bring all of those topics together because they really do interact. For the last couple of years, I was a program director of a prevention program in the Sacramento area. And we focused so much on preventing the actual substances, but I was really curious about looking at the mental health side of things. And so I started working with schools and talking with different youth, and so much of the issues really were underlying with these mental health, what really stemmed from mental health and trauma. And so that's really what we're going to be talking about today, is how all of these things are intertwined and really connected. I find it hard to talk about substance use prevention if we're not also talking about mental health and trauma. Okay. I also want to say that, with trauma, mental health, substances, all of this, these are big topics. And I doubt there's anybody on this call that hasn't been personally impacted by these topics. So I just really want to acknowledge that and encourage you to take care of yourself during this time. And if you need to step away for a moment, like, that's totally okay. Please do what's right for you, because these can be big and triggering topics for people. So I just really wanted to acknowledge that as well. All right, so today we are going to be talking about kind of what is the root of addiction, what is trauma, and then we'll talk about ACEs, which stands for adverse childhood experiences. And then towards the end, we'll talk more about marijuana specifically and the brain. And then, of course, how that impacts our communities, and also what you can do as a community member to help with those impacts. All right, so where does addiction come from? We are going to go ahead and ask a poll question. So this is just, there's so many different ways that we can think about this, but I'm just going to throw a poll question out there and hear from our audience around, where do you think addiction comes from? Sarah Michael, whenever you get a moment, there you go, you're on it. Beautiful. So go ahead and take a moment to fill out the poll question. All right, we're almost there.
It looks like people can change their answer, which is pretty cool.
All right.
There's one more person possibly. Would you like me to end the poll?
Yeah, let's go ahead and do that.
And then share the results.
Sure. Yes, please. Okay. So, do you believe the cause of addiction is due to disease, mental illness? Yep, looks like one person believes that, medication or coping from trauma, and then a combination of factors and not sure. Yeah. So kind of that trick question, right? Is it's like combination of factors, not really sure. That's kind of the point of this, is to really see that there are many combination of factors that come into why somebody does what they do, especially when it comes to addiction. And so the first two, a disease or mental illness, and then self-medication, coping from trauma, again, it goes back to which comes first. I kind of think about this as like the chicken or the egg, right? Is it that we are born with this disease and we were born with this mental illness, or is it that we experience trauma and therefore that links to self-medication and that leads to mental illness, right? So which comes first, the chicken or the egg? Which comes first, trauma or mental illness? And that's really the point that I'm trying to make with this talk today, is which does come first. Let's look at it a little bit more. So, right, there's our little chicken, or chicken and the egg. So you may have heard of this study called the Rat Park study. Okay, so in this study, basically scientists had rats in cages, like kind of individual cages, and they would have one water bottle with water and one water bottle with heroin, and see which one the rat would go to. Okay, the rat ignored the water and was all doped up on heroin. Okay, cool, easy way to say if you have access, you will use the drugs. Okay, but then what happened is they started kind of looking at this and realizing, hey, this isn't really natural, right? This isn't really a natural situation to have these rats in cages and to give them these options this way. So what they did was they actually built a whole community, a whole area for rats, kind of like a rat park. And they had males and females, they had little areas for nesting, they had exercise, they had a lot of rats in here kind of living their best life, so to speak, right? All the food, all the water, the community, being able to mate, being able to raise young, all of that was provided for them in this community. And then they offered them the heroin. And what they found was that the rats didn't take it. The rats weren't actually using the drugs. They were going after the water and the regular food and things like that, but they weren't going after the drugs. So, what they've kind of come to conclude, as one journalist says very eloquently, is the opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. That is one of my absolute favorite quotes because it just kind of hits to the root of things. You know, when we think of addiction, I don't know if you have anybody in your life who is an addict of sorts or has been addicted to things in the past. I know I have. And I think of a lot when I think about them, I think of the word isolation comes to mind a lot. And it's kind of this perpetual cycle of using substances excessively, abusing substances, and then having isolation, and then feeling isolation, and then wanting to turn to substances. So that's why I really appreciate this quote, because it's not talking about, the pathology or things like that. It's really talking about basic, simple connection. If we're able to give people what they need on a very basic level, then they might not turn to those substances. So then we want to talk about, well, what about trauma, right? Well, what is trauma in the first place? So I'm curious if you could take a moment in the chat and write in what you believe is your definition of trauma. Okay, so just go ahead and take a moment there. And what is trauma from your perspective? In lieu of being in person, I try to make things as interactive as possible. So hopefully we're able to get some responses in there.
Anyone?
Trauma results from being put in an unnatural situation. Okay. Something not typical for humans in a healthy environment. Experience someone as negatively impacts their mental health. Each person's trauma is unique. Yeah, that's a really good point. Is that trauma has a lot to do with your own personal perspective on things. One person could experience a car accident and another person could experience the same exact car accident and have it be traumatic for one and not for the other. Okay. Deep, disturbing experience, emotional shock, bad things happen to the environment, poverty, violence, component of past, present, and future, happen in the past, present, future, Happened in the past, present, fear of it happening in the future. Okay. Event that disturbs our mental health. Trauma is something that can harm. Multiple reoccurring incidences, snowball effect of emotional distress on life. Yeah. So it seems like you all have a really good understanding of something bad happened, right? Something that was distressing for the body and for the brain. It is a body thing as well. I think that's a really important point that scientists and researchers and the psychological field is really talking more about these days, is how much the trauma is being held in the body and not just in the brain. And I think that is really fascinating, that the body holds on to anything. I don't know if anybody is familiar with the book by Dr. Van Bresselcourt, but it is called The Body Keeps the Score. And it talks all about how trauma is held in the body and how that impacts our physical health and our mental health, which we will definitely talk more about as we go. Okay. So what is trauma? Trauma is an experience that overwhelms the central nervous system, altering the way we process and recall memories. So yes, Bessel van der Kolk is where we're getting that quote from. Again, he is seen as a leading researcher in the field of trauma these days. So we can learn a lot from him and his research. Again, this is different for everybody. And you might also be born into this lifetime, into this world, with a central nervous system that is already heightened because of the way, because of your mother's nervous system, your father's nervous system, because of what happened during the womb or during the time you were in the womb. And also, like, all of those things impact how we're going to experience the world. And so that is going to have an impact on what is seen as trauma for us. So yeah, examples of trauma: individual and family experiences, witnessing. So if we witness a traumatic event, if we witness a shooting, if we witness a car accident, if we witness war, if we witness domestic violence, if we witness violence against a sibling, that is shown to be really impactful, because there's this helpless feeling. When you're a witness to something, it increases the helplessness of the situation. And it's almost seen, like, the results are almost as more negative than when we experience it ourselves, because we can't help the person that we love, right? So that's also a trauma, is that when we can't help the person. And then also community events, right? School shootings, racial injustices, these are becoming so much more common in our culture today. And, it's kind of like we're wondering, oh, well, what's so bad about right now? It's like, well, if you look around, there's a lot of things going on where we're witnessing, we're living through that with vicarious trauma, right? So vicarious trauma is when you're experiencing the trauma by hearing about it through somebody else. So oftentimes, therapists, social workers, I'm sure in your own worlds, working with youth, hearing about what's going on in their families, all the racial injustices that are happening, the shootings that are happening, those are all vicarious trauma. So we are all being traumatized by these events that are happening, and it's increasing our central nervous system, right? That might be really traumatic for somebody, and it might not be as traumatic for the other person. But just know that vicarious trauma is absolutely a real thing. And so taking care of ourselves and acknowledging and being able to normalize that for the students that we work with can also be really impactful too. And if we have a student that's scared of going to school, okay, we can acknowledge that, like, hey, you've probably seen, you have this vicarious trauma that you've seen, or people are afraid to go out in public or talk with the police, or all of these things. Well, yes, absolutely, we have reasons for that, and we can help normalize that. There's nothing wrong with that, but we can talk through that. We can discuss what that means. We can discuss safety protocols. We can discuss how to tamp down the central nervous system through different ways, different modalities, different breathing exercises, things like that, that help decrease the central nervous system so that trauma isn't impacting us as strongly. And then generational trauma. This is also one that is becoming more and more popular these days, more and more known about these days. It used to not be, we used to not look very far back in generational trauma, but now there is this known phenomenon called epigenetics. So epigenetics is the changing of our basically, it's the turning on and off of genes is the simple way of saying it. It's turning on and off genes in our bodies when something happens. So if we go through a traumatic event, that trauma through our central nervous system will literally turn off or on certain genes in our body. And then we pass that on to our offspring. And so then they are born with specific genes that are turned on or turned off in their body. And then based on their traumatic experiences or healing their traumatic experiences, certain genes get turned on and off, and then those get passed down. So if there are families that have experienced, slavery, the Holocaust, right? Genocide of any kind, that is all turning on and off certain genes in the body, and they're passing that down. So generational trauma is a very real and physical thing that shows up in the body. Not to mention, if you have somebody who is dealt with trauma and they're an alcoholic, then you have the environment of being raised with an alcoholic, but then you also have those genes of being raised by an alcoholic. So you have kind of both of those situations happening. And if they're an alcoholic, then that tends to increase the chances of trauma happening, whether that's domestic violence or physical abuse, mental, all those things. So then you have the genes, and then you have the actual environment, and then you have what you're witnessing through that trauma. So there's many different ways that trauma can be passed down. And I think it's important to recognize that it's happening on a physical level as well, and not just in an environmental level. Now, I do really want to say that those cycles can be broken, right? We all know people, maybe us ourselves, I know in my family I am a cycle breaker, and so that in its own self, when we do heal that trauma, it also changes our genes. And then we are able to pass that on. We're able to help our central nervous system decrease, right? And decrease in, when I say decrease, I mean not be so heightened. And so we're able to help do that. So the more like work we can do on ourselves to help our central nervous system not be overwhelmed, the better off it can be for future generations. And that's also something I like to talk about with young people. I love working with young people because they have the whole rest of their life. If they start looking at their traumas now, if they can start giving language and support and therapy and positive adults in their lives at a young age, they are just setting themselves up for such a better future. And that's a really important thing, is being that cycle breaker and also changing it on a very fundamental level of, genes and DNA. All right. So speaking of childhood traumas, we're going to talk about adverse childhood experiences. Now, I imagine that some of us have heard about adverse childhood experiences, or also known as ACEs. And just to give a little overview, this was first, ACEs were one of those things that was kind of stumbled upon in the medical field. There was a study done at Kaiser, and they were noticing it was actually a weight loss study. And the weight loss study, they were noticing that people would lose weight and then they'd get to a certain point and then they'd stop losing weight and then they'd gain it all back. Maybe you've had this experience yourself. I know I have. So it's like, right, you kind of lose the weight and then they gain it back and then lose the weight and then gain it back. And they started asking questions about childhood. And this had never been done before. Like, oftentimes people separate those things. But these doctors started questioning about childhood and found that almost all these people in this weight loss program had experienced quite a bit of childhood trauma. And so then they started asking questions and they started doing studies. And the questionnaire that they use is 10 different sections. One is personal type of experience, all different types of abuse. Then there's family experience. They ask about addiction, mental illness, loss of parent, domestic violence. And what they found was pretty incredible. So there's 10 different factors. And in those 10 different factors, what they have found is the more points you have, like out of 10, the more increase there is for all negative issues, mentally and physically. So, impacts on addiction. People with one ACE are 2 to 4 times more likely to start using alcohol or drugs at an early age. And then people with an ACE score of 5 or above are 10 times more likely to experience addiction. And this is just when it comes to addiction, because that's our topic today. This also has big impacts on all types of diseases, obesity, heart disease, all types of diseases. But when we're talking about addiction, just one ACE, you are 2 to 4 times more likely to start using alcohol or drugs at an early age. And then 5 or more, 10 times. So that's a good amount. So I do have a short little video I wanted to show about this topic. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen just to give a little bit more information.
A child's experiences early in life are important building blocks for the developing brain. Genes, nature, are like the blueprint. They provide the basic framework for brain development. However, genes do not design the brain completely. Environmental influences, nurture, fine-tune how the brain works by shaping which brain connections get used. Connections that are used more grow stronger and more permanent, whereas ones that do not get much use fade away. Together, genes and the environment build the foundation for all future development. Safe, stable, and nurturing relationships early in life lead to healthy development. But children's brains capture other experiences as well. Stressful events. However, not all stress is bad. Positive stress involves normal childhood experiences, like starting daycare or meeting a new person for the first time. This stress is essential for healthy development because it helps children develop coping skills and confidence. But when stress is frequent, chronic, and uncontrolled, it is toxic to children, especially when they do not have a caregiver to provide support or buffer the stress. Adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, such as abuse, neglect, exposure to intimate partner violence, parental depression or addiction, and poverty, are toxic stressors which could lead to lifelong changes in learning and behavior. ACEs early in development can impact social, emotional, and cognitive functioning, increased risk-taking behavior such as drinking and substance use, and increased risk of disease, disability, and social problems later in life. The question is, how do adverse childhood experiences impact a lifelong development? One of the most important systems in our body is our stress system. It's activated when we experience stress. We become alert, our heart rate increases, and so do our stress hormone levels, cortisol and adrenaline. Our body is ready to react, what is known as fight or flight. A short period of time after the stress is over, or if a child receives support from a caregiver, the stress response turns off and the body returns to a normal state. Adverse childhood experiences create stress responses that stay active, and without the support of a caregiver, the system has difficulty shutting off completely. This constant and prolonged activation can affect immune system functioning and increase the chances of sickness, infection, and disease. Prolonged activation of stress hormones is also toxic to the brain. Certain areas of the brain are more vulnerable to toxic stress, including the executive center or the brain's control center, an area important for solving complex problems, attention, reasoning, impulsivity, inhibition, and learning. A second area is the emotional center, the brain's alarm system, which is involved in processing and interpreting emotions and the ability to control impulses. The third area is the memory and learning center, the brain's filing cabinet, which plays a major role in learning and the formation and retrieval of memories. Science shows that adverse childhood experiences impact all of these brain centers. Behaviorally, what we begin to see is emotional distress, poor emotion regulation, greater impulsivity, learning difficulties, and physical and mental health problems. More recently, science has begun to look at how ACEs cause changes in gene expression through a process called epigenetics, which helps us understand how nature and nurture interact. Epigenetics causes changes in the way genes work without changing the DNA code itself. This occurs through chemical changes influencing how the code is used. In other words, genes are like the hardware in a computer. They determine the boundaries of what is possible. However, we need an operating system to tell the hardware what to do. Epigenetics is like the operating system directing the function of a gene's DNA hardware. The genes we are born with are the genes that we have for life, but experiences like nutrition, exercise, smoking, stressors, and relationships all affect our biology. Adverse childhood experiences are associated with epigenetic changes related to stress, brain development, cognition, and systems associated with mental and physical health. Changes that happen early in brain development are more likely to be enduring and are possibly passed on to future generations as well. The good news is that positive, supportive relationships at any stage in life can make a difference. However, supporting families and children early on will help prevent many of these negative outcomes. One of the key ingredients for healthy development is having warm, loving, and actively engaged caregivers. This involves promoting serve and return interactions, where caregivers actively and warmly engage with the child, making eye contact, responding to sounds, words, gestures, emotional needs, and sharing experiences like reading and play. Providing programs that support caregivers to strengthen these abilities are the blocks that build healthy foundations for life.
All right.
That was a great video. Thanks, Brinn.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to kind of, it's helpful to hear it from different perspectives, right? All right, let's get back to it. Sharing. Nope, wrong one. Okay. Okay. So now that we've talked a little bit about mental health, trauma, how that leads to addiction, we're going to talk about marijuana because it is often the drug of choice for teenage addiction and for young people. So oftentimes what people think about marijuana, and this is often young people, they'll think marijuana is not addictive. A lot of people think this, it's not addictive, but in reality, 1 out of 6 people who start using under age 18 will become addicted to something as an adult. And I think that's like a really important thing to acknowledge, because if you're using at a young age, it is impacting the brain development, and it's actually increasing the need for addiction and the need for substances. And so it might not necessarily be marijuana that somebody is addicted to, but you're basically setting your brain up to be dependent on things, and from a very physical level. So that's an important piece that I think can be helpful when talking to young people, because what I've found in the prevention world is that obviously the whole like don't do drugs thing didn't work, right? that didn't work so well. But what does work, what is happening, is educating around the facts of the situation. And once we know about the facts of the situation, then the young people are able to then make their own decisions. And that's really important for teenagers and young people, is making their own choices about things. And oftentimes when they get the correct information, they're able to make choices for themselves that are actually a lot healthier than based on the myths that they thought about. Okay. And then, so another thing that people think is that marijuana is used to lower anxiety and symptoms of depression. The reality is today's marijuana has an increased amount of THC in it, which can lead to increased anxiety, increased depression, psychosis, schizophrenia, and even suicide. So today's marijuana, right? We're calling it not your mama's marijuana is what we often say in the prevention world. It is so different these days than even like 20 years ago. Marijuana is being is commercialized now that it's legalized. It's very much commercialized, and it is being genetically modified to increase the amount of THC in it, which is the part that gets you high. So there are these concentrates being made that are like liquid form, and there are some upwards of like 99% THC. Now, compared to, 20 years ago, if you had a plant that grew marijuana and, then that would probably have about 5% THC. So that's what like people were like used to, known about, like that was like, okay, that was 5%. Now it's upwards of, could be 99%. It's and then what's coming off the plants is probably around like 25 to 30%. So it's unknown. It's really a huge experiment what that level of THC does to the brain. And what they're finding is that it's increasing anxiety, depression, psychosis, schizophrenia, and even suicide. So you have about 8 times more likely to develop or have early onset of schizophrenia if you're using marijuana as a young person. So it's pretty impactful. Now that is just talking about THC. That is not talking about CBD, which is another chemical that's also found in marijuana, but CBD does not have the high effects. And so almost any teenager that is using this for recreation is using THC as opposed to the CBD. Another thing people think is if it were bad, it wouldn't be legalized, right? Like how many times have I heard that from young people? They're like, well, the adults legalized it, so it must be good. It's like, if that were the case, we have other things to talk about. But the reality is, marijuana has been found to have negative impacts on the developing brain, right? The Surgeon General of the United States 2 years ago came out saying definitively that marijuana has a negative impact on the developing brain and is negative, and that even goes back to in utero. So it is not recommended for women who are pregnant, and it is not recommended for young people at all. And so this was a huge moment in history, because it had been since like the 60s, I believe, that the Surgeon General had made any claims, and they had not made claims about people who are pregnant. And so there is also another myth that is often talked about, is that vaping is okay if you're pregnant. It's different than tobacco, things like that. But there's really definitive research right now that people who are pregnant, when the baby is in utero, there are negative impacts on that as well. Okay, so I'm looking at the chat and I see a couple questions. What's the difference between addiction and dependency? That's a good question. For the purposes of what we're talking about here, I see them as the same thing, because it's also kind of like when we're talking about young people, it's like use, or like there's substance use or there's substance abuse. But according to the DSM, the Diagnostical Statistical Manual, young people cannot use substances in a healthy way, right? Because it's illegal. And so if there's any sort of use, it is automatically misuse. And so I kind of think about that same thing with like addiction and dependency. Bina, the studies and the impact of on youth, it is really hard to study youth. It is really hard to get consent with that. And so, but they are seeing from people who have used that yes, there are negative parts of the brain for sure. So there are definitely studies. I actually have a picture of a 16-year-old's brain in the next slide that talks about that shows the negative impacts on the developing brain from marijuana. Kyle, this slide is not saying THC causes schizophrenia. Nope. It is saying with the increased amount of THC, it can lead to increased anxiety, depression, psychosis, schizophrenia, and even suicide. So it can lead to that. It is not saying that it definitively does. All right. So yeah, how marijuana impacts the developing brain. So it changes the brain's shape, volume, and interferes with neurotransmitters. This is a picture of a 16-year-old with a 2-year history of daily abuse. Notice that there's a marked decrease in prefrontal cortex and temporal lobe activity. So this is really interesting because this would have been my brain when I was 16. When I was 16, I had a 2-year history of using marijuana and further of daily use. And use went back farther than that. So it's really interesting to see how that shows up in the brain. So it changes the brain's shape, the volume, interferes with neurotransmitters, impacts concentration, thinking, sensory, time perception, pleasure, memory, coordination. It also impacts the impairment of these areas happen when you're high, like after you use the substance, but it's also happening several days after. So they did studies where people they would use the substance, and then after multiple days, like still having the same negative impacts, but then after a few weeks, having those of not using, having those impacts not be as severe. So especially with a developing brain, it can it's a lot more pliable, and so when there's the usage has stopped, it's a lot easier for the brain to repair itself. Studies show that the impact of marijuana is greater than alcohol. And there's also a reduction in IQ points by the time they reach adulthood if there is consistent use in a young person's brain. This is one. Has anybody ever heard of scromiting? This is quite an interesting one.
No.
Scromiting. Monica's like, yes, I've heard of it. Thank you.
Yeah, it's pretty bad.
Yeah. So scromiting is basically what was happening was people were coming into the emergency room and vomiting and screaming, right? And then people would be like, did you take something? Like, what's wrong? And they would say, no, nothing's changed. Like, this is like, I don't know why this is happening. But what they weren't asking about was, were you using marijuana? Because they were using it such regularly that they didn't think that it was bad. They don't think of it as, oh, I took a drug. They're just like, oh yeah, usually it happens with the vape pens. If you have a pen that has concentrated amounts of THC in them, like I was saying, the increased amount of THC is having a really harmful effect. And so you can develop the cannabinoid hypermesis syndrome, or known as scromiting, which is a combination of vomiting and screaming, scromiting. And what they found is like the only way to like reduce symptoms is by taking like a super, super hot bath or shower. And like that's supposed to calm you down. Yeah. Yes, thank you for sharing, Monica. So yes, ER doctors who are seeing an increased amount of cases amongst young people because of the vape pens. So they have these pens, you know, that are vape pens that are concentrated amounts of THC. Like I was saying, they're in liquid form, concentrated amounts of THC, and then young people will puff on those, right? They'll take hit after hit after hit after hit and not realize how much they're actually ingesting into their body. And as a result, this is one of the things that can happen. So it's another example of we don't know what this high concentrates, what the high percentage of THC concentrates are doing. Like no one knew that that was a thing until these concentrates came around, and now it's a big experiment, right? What is this going to do to the brain in the long term? What's this going to do to the body? You know, we don't know because there isn't research on it, because it hasn't been around for that long. This is really like new things. Yeah. So Jesse, you bring up a really good point. When I say use is misuse in youth, how can we reframe that? You're absolutely right. That is not my term for it. I'm saying in the prevention world, in the medical world, because of the legalities of you know, underage use, that is what it is seen as. And I do agree that yeah, a harm reduction reframe would be appropriate for that. I was speaking more from what it is seen from the medical point of view.
And I feel like, Brinn, that's good to know how the medical field sees it, because when young people are going to the hospital or maybe you know, experiencing a crisis, like that might be how their people interact with them, of it's the misuse. So like understanding that that is the framework, and you know, possibly how it's not harm reduction centered, maybe you can prepare your young people to like know this is how you might be perceived, and that might mitigate the traumatic experience, if it is one.
Yeah, it's a good point. Thank you. So according to Brain Science, Dr. Amen, I don't know if anyone's familiar with Dr. Amen, but the website is really awesome. Dr. Amen is a brain scientist. He's a neurologist that looks at mental health through the lens of neurology. Basically, he talks about how if you have a broken bone, they're going to do x-rays. If you have something going on in your stomach, you're going to get an ultrasound. We look at the body in every single medical way except mental health. And I love that he talks about that, because the medical world often separates the body from the brain. And that is just simply not true. It's part of the brain. That's how it works. And so his website's really fun because he has all of these pictures of all of these different brains from all these different people. So whether it's addiction or trauma or ADHD or schizophrenia, all of these different brains are showed on the website. So if you want a moment to check that out, it's pretty cool. It's also a really great way to get treatment, especially for long-term issues that other treatments aren't helping. I think it's a really great resource. So yeah, Dr. Amen. Anywho, he says recovery and healing of your brain is possible. And I think this is a really good point, especially when we work with young people, is that recovery and healing is possible. Absolutely. When it comes to mental health issues, challenges, when it comes to any sort of addiction stuff, recovery and healing is possible. And then your brain health is equivalent to your mental and your physical health. Again, looking at this from like a holistic perspective around, we are all a whole being. We are not a separate from the neck down or the neck up, right? We are a whole being. So brain health is equivalent to your mental and physical health, which is kind of cool, because if you can help your brain be healthy, it will automatically help your mental and your physical health too, and vice versa. So keep your brain healthy and the rest will follow. So how do you do that? How do you keep your brain healthy? By making healthy choices. So it's really as simple as we all know: fruits and vegetables, physical activity, healthy connective relationships, spending time in nature, meditation. Meditation does wonders for the physical brain. Meditation might have all sorts of connotations for you, things like that. But the reality is, when there is meditation practice on a regular, consistent basis, it physically shows in the brain. The brain grows gray matter, and gray matter helps with reducing the charge from your central nervous system, which we talked about earlier. Trauma increases the central nervous reaction. So if we're able to decrease the central nervous system reaction, we are able to decrease the effects of the trauma. Okay. So this is very, very important to recognize that these things are not just healthy for our physical body, but for our brain. Our brain can absolutely benefit from these things. And this is something that I have personal experience with as well, because like I said earlier, when I was 16, my brain looked like that. I started smoking pot when I was 9 years old. So what that did to my brain, I will never know. But I know that I had all those symptoms. And so when I became older, and I was always physical, I was always on sports teams, so that was a plus. I had healthy, positive relationships. But when I got older, the food, the fruits, the vegetables, the meditation, spending time in nature, spirituality is this other one that I did not mention. All of those things have positive impacts on the brain. And I really genuinely think that a lot of those habits that I created later in life helped shape my brain in a more positive way. I hope. So how can we use this information in our communities? Rarely recognizing that trauma is a warning sign for early substance use. That is a really important part, is that if we have some people who are struggling, getting this information to them about substances, maybe even telling them like, hey, you've experienced this, so you might be thinking about this, or statistics show you might be start using this. Like, let's talk about it, right? Let's not wait until this is a problem. Let's say, hey, you've experienced things. Let's discuss this now. And being really upfront about it and really recognizing that this is a warning sign for early substance use. Also, mental health issues, mental health challenges are early signs, are warning signs for early substance use also. And getting the right kind of support in all of those situations. Also, things to take into consideration are diagnoses like anxiety, depression, ADHD, PTSD, and bipolar all have increased rates of addiction. And specifically ADHD. And there's kind of this impulsivity, thrill-seeking part of it. Same with bipolar. But just in general, that kind of goes with the earlier statement of mental health issues or earlier warning signs, but also mental health challenges don't have to be full-blown diagnoses. And so we want to recognize that the early on mental health challenges can lead to full-blown diagnoses, and they can also lead to substance use. And one of those ways is getting counseling for young people who've experienced trauma is one way to help with that early intervention. Teaching healthy coping skills is at a young age, right? Because oftentimes people will turn to substances because they don't know how to deal, they don't know how to cope. And so we're able to teach some of those healthy coping skills, then that's even better. And then, as we've repeated many times, positive adult relationships, right? Just one adult can make a difference in a young person's life. And that is not something to take lightly. That is very, very proven and can make a huge difference. So I do have another, I know we're going till 10:30. So I do have another video that talks about how to interact with ACEs on a community level. And so I thought that would be beneficial to show as well. If people, I know some people might have to jump off, but I'm going to go ahead and show that as well, because those interventions that I spoke of can be one-on-one, but I really like this video because it shows it from a community perspective and like kind of that wraparound idea.
Hi, this is my neighborhood.
Let me start it and then share my screen. Here we go.
Hi, this is my neighborhood. I grew up in this building. This is a great community now, but it's had its share of problems. When I was a kid, our community had high unemployment, a lack of resources for families, and lots of kids hanging out with no adult supervision. You might have heard about adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. ACEs are traumatic events in childhood, like abuse and neglect, that can increase risk for future problems. But they don't have to. The good news is that ACEs and their consequences can be prevented. Take me, for example. I was at risk for ACEs, and despite all the things that put me at risk, some pretty incredible people helped make sure that I wouldn't become another statistic. Come on, I'll show you around. That's Jackson. He's a cool kid. His dad left when he was 2, and his mom works 2 jobs. I hang out with him every Thursday night and help him with his homework. Sometimes we grab ice cream. It's fun. Plus, he has another adult role model to learn from and trust. That's Mr. Martino. When I was a kid, he let me help him at the store sometimes after school when my parents were working late. He did that for a bunch of us. My dad actually found his job as a mechanic because of Mr. Martino. This helped our family in so many ways. Not only did my dad have a steady paycheck, which eased his stress about paying rent and buying necessities like food and clothes, but he was also a lot nicer to me, my brother, and my mom once he started working a job that made him feel good about himself. When communities come together, they can do so much to prevent ACEs. Mr. Martino and other local business owners put together a series of career workshops to help people like my dad find work. My mom also got a job with a company that allowed her to work from home and spend more time with me and my brother. Mariana has just gotten out of a class about handling challenges of single parenting. The clinic offers free childcare so Mariana's daughter, Ella, can play while Mariana's in class. The class helps parents like Mariana develop positive parenting skills, not just for babies and toddlers, but for teenagers too. This is another way our community has come together to give families the resources they need, and just one more way to prevent ACEs. This was my school, Riverside Middle, right in the heart of town. These kids are here for a sponsored summer camp. This community-supported program helps families with affordable, quality childcare and helps kids get tutoring and learn life skills. When I was a kid, I spent a lot of time at this school all year long. There was one counselor, Miss Greer, who I remember more than anyone. She was a really good listener. Miss Greer helped me and my brother get involved in after-school activities like baseball and soccer. Our coaches were super nice and were mentors to us. Staying after school for practice kept us and a lot of other kids out of trouble. When schools help take responsibility for preventing ACEs, everybody wins. My life could have gone in a completely different direction. Studies show that ACEs can have long-term negative effects on kids' health and well-being that may last into adulthood and even continue in future generations. But by people and groups taking action, ACEs can be prevented. In fact, there are 5 known strategies that help stop ACEs before they even start. You can implement them in your own community, just like we did. How? By strengthening economic support for families, by changing social norms to support parents in positive parenting, by providing quality care and education early in life, by enhancing parenting skills to promote healthy child development, and by intervening to lessen harms and prevent future risk. So, now you know my story, and you've seen the prevention strategies in my community that helped me beat the odds. I had healthy relationships with my family and friends. I learned how to take care of myself and make good choices. And today, I'm a mentor to other kids who need some extra help so they don't become an ACEs statistic. Safe, stable, and nurturing relationships and environments are essential to prevent child abuse and neglect and to assure that all kids reach their full potential. Are you thinking what I'm thinking? Banana split? You got it.
All right. So I know that that video really focused a lot on ACEs in general and less around the specifics around substance use. But in my mind, as we've talked about, if there's trauma, then that leads a lot to substance use. And so that's why I just thought it would be a good video to share. And a little bit on that high note about things you can do and probably seeing a lot of things in that area that you already are doing. And so in conclusion, we want to look for warning signs of early trauma and mental health challenges in young people. Use that information to ramp up early prevention tactics with counseling, information, positive adult relationships, etc. Help young people understand the negative impacts of early marijuana use. Then help all people understand that recovery from addiction, mental health challenges, and trauma is possible. These are not lifelong destined issues, but they can be resolved with intervention. and that everyday habits go a long way to heal the brain, which in turn heals the psychological and the physical body as well. All right, so I would love to open it up for any comments, questions, discussion. I know this is a lot, so I'm open and would love to hear from you all.
Thank you so much, Brinn. That was an amazing presentation on mental health, trauma, and addiction. And I know I've learned so much, and I'm sure a lot of people have taken some good nuggets away. So really just want to give you a round of applause for that. And yes, please, everyone, please help me in thanking Brinn. And if you have any questions, please, now's the time to put them in the chat or unmute yourself, and we'll try to answer them.
Mia, the website was the Dr. Amen Clinic. Amen, A-M-E-N.
I want to chime in really quickly. Is that okay, Sarah?
Yeah.
I don't know. Oh. I thought that was super great, Brinn, because I have to be honest, like marijuana is becoming one of those tricky topics in culture and society today, because I feel like now that it's become legal recreationally, like it's just becoming a lot trickier to try to inform youth of the harmful impacts of using so early on, because they see it, I mean, music, movies, like, you know, pop culture, all of those things. And then it's also like we're also seeing the marijuana industry mirror a lot of what the tobacco industry used to do, which is, you know, targeting ads for young people, making it like flavorful, candy, like things like that. And so I really appreciate like learning about the connection between mental health and substance use. I myself, marijuana wasn't used in my family, but alcoholism was definitely prevalent. And I feel like that's something that, you know, if young people realize like they can actually break those cycles, they don't have to necessarily continue those cycles in their family, even though it can be something that's like normalized sometimes in families. They don't necessarily have to go that route if it isn't supporting them in the ways that they need. Yeah. So I just found this super helpful. My question was around the dependency, mostly because I feel like I've seen that happen a lot among young people where they say they're not addicted, but in particular, like they feel like they have to use at least once a day. In their mind, they're like, well, I'm not using like multiple times a day. I'm not getting super high all the time, but I definitely need to use at least once a day. So I'm just wondering, like, if there's any information on, like, I guess, different levels of use among young people, because there are definitely some who I feel like use on a daily basis, but they basically claim they're not addicted because they're like, oh, well, I don't use excessively on a daily basis, you know?
Absolutely. I'm sorry. I got kicked out of the meeting and now I'm back. So I missed some of that. I'm sorry, Monica.
Yeah, I thought I saw you go away. I was like, where's she?
Peace out. I don't need to talk to you. No.
But my question was mostly around like, how do we talk about like, I guess the difference between and still like the harmful effects of like daily dependency use versus just like a young person like saying, well, I'm not addicted because I don't get like super stoned every day. I just like, I don't know, use a little bit every day.
Yeah, and I think that kind of goes back to the whole like use and misuse thing, like with young people, their brains are developing. And that's really what it comes down to, is no amount of substances on the brain is positive, right? Like, it's not a positive thing to have substances on the brain, whether that's alcohol or marijuana or tobacco or anything, sugar, right? Like, that is not helpful for the developing brain. So that's really what it comes down to, is like, that's why we can't say, okay, well, you just do it a little bit, so it's totally fine for your brain. That's just not, as an adult, I do not personally feel comfortable condoning that, because I know that it's not good for them. Now, that's a conversation to have. Like, you can absolutely be like, you know what? Once you're 25, your brain is solidified. Every once in a while, whatever, but like, that's a conversation you can have. You can have a conversation.
I know. Brinn, you're like breaking up a lot. Your audio's going in and out, so your connection might be not working. And we didn't get that last part of what you were saying about having a conversation with a young person that doesn't think they're maybe addicted to marijuana. Oh man. Well, I just was gonna say, Drusella put a comment in the chat about how adults also don't know this information and don't think they can abuse marijuana or understand the ways in which it can prevent their healing, especially when they've been using as teens. And so I think it's all connected, in terms of young people using and and adults also not understanding how, them using in their developing brains, it can negatively impact them. So they're not going to say anything because they just don't, realize that, using before, your brain has fully developed can have harmful impacts. And also, just like what Brinn was saying, she shared her story, which thank you. And you said, you don't know the impacts that using marijuana at 16 had on you, had on your development, because you just, may not know. But it can it can impact you. And so I think we do want to try to prevent that and educate young people on these are the effects, so that they are fully aware and they can make informed decisions. And Brinn was also saying, like, we want to support young people in making their own choices, having autonomy. And with that, I think we have to educate them. So Brinn, yeah, I was telling everyone that your connection was just like going in and out, but just how, like, Drusella had mentioned, adults just don't know some of this information either. So there's just not, everybody thinks like it's a safe drug and it's okay, but there really are, things we have to be cautious about. And like you were saying, it's something that, it's important to talk to young people about. And I think to continue that conversation, like, not it be like a one-time deal and then just like, give up. Right. Obviously, you don't want to push them or push your, judgments or just, how you think it should be, but having open and honest communication with them, I think, will help.
Absolutely. That's a really great point, that ongoing conversation.
Monica, was there anything you wanted to add?
No, that was mostly it, but I really, like I said, I appreciate this presentation because it definitely, and I agree with Drusella, like there's even people our age or like older than us who don't know this information. So I feel like some people don't realize that the THC levels are so different. Like you said in the beginning, Brinn, like people don't realize that. And that's really what's having the worst impact on the generation using marijuana now.
Absolutely. Yeah, it would be a totally different ball game, like if it were around the levels as it was 20 years ago. And if access wasn't as easily accessible as it is now it's like, oh, you get delivered to your house. Oh, you can drink a soda with THC in it. Oh, you go online, you Snapchat someone, and all of a sudden you have, you know, a pen being delivered. Like, that's what's going on. So it's totally different than how it used to be.
And I think some young people, they just may not, like Monica was saying, that they wouldn't consider themselves addicted because they might associate addiction with like using daily, multiple times a day. But I think something you had mentioned, Monica, was like it, you know, could be tied to they experience something or they use it to cope. And that is, you know, after like, you know, maybe a stressful situation, like that is their thing that they go to. And just like understanding like that can be part of addiction. Is using it to soothe or to cope or what have you, and you know possibly finding
Yeah. And I
healthier
think a
some
lot of
healthier
people,
ways to cope. Yeah.
yeah. So when I was a kid, I never ever admitted that I was addicted. I would never say I was addicted. And it wasn't until I look back and be like, oh, absolutely is marijuana addictive. And so I have that conversation with young people all the time, or just anyone who says, you know, marijuana is not addicted. I'm like, oh, excuse me, can we have a conversation about that? Because it is absolutely addictive. And, you know, and I, just in the way, like so many things are addictive, and they're physical withdrawals that the body goes through that we don't realize are withdrawals. So like, you know, people talk about the munchies or like the increased hunger, like that's actually a withdrawal symptom. Or anxiety is a withdrawal symptom. And people don't realize that. They just think it's like normal part of, you know, smoking or whatever. But those are withdrawal symptoms. Irritability too. Does anyone else have any more questions or thoughts or comments? Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, Nia. Like, it might not look traditional, but holds you back from building something better. Yeah, I mean, if you think of addiction, you can literally be addicted to anything. You think about screen time, right? Like phones. Phones are doing the same exact thing. I had a conversation with a student, with one of my clients, about phone usage. And I said, think about using your phone and think about how, like, to think about taking a hit of marijuana every time you try to pick up your phone when you're trying to distract yourself. Right. And then they were like, whoa, oh my gosh, I would be so addicted to drugs if I used drugs. And I'm like, yeah, exactly. It's the same thing with your phone. So yeah, thanks, Sarah Michael. Everyone's gonna out themselves for being addicted to their screens. But it's true. It's like I think changing the way we look at addiction is also really important. And I think that's a really good point. So it's changing the brain. Screens are changing the brain. Phone use is changing the brain. Same thing with any sort of substances. It's changing the brain. And it's, yeah, like you said, holding yourself back from being a better self. So yeah, you're absolutely right.
Well, if there are no more questions, we can close out this presentation, and just thank you all so much for coming. I will share this out with everyone, and hopefully the slides, if Brinn would be so kind. And it will also be on the YouTube channel that I shared earlier in the chat, so you can look at it there. But really just appreciate you all getting up Friday morning to come and learn with each other and just being, engaged in this space. So thank you. And thank you,
Yeah,
Brinn.
thank you so much. Thanks everyone for coming out. Appreciate it. And I'm totally available if anyone has any other like organizations or groups of students or anything like that, and you want to have conversations, feel free to like check out my website for other trainings that I offer on this topic and for others. So thanks so much, everyone. Have a great weekend.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.